Today we're giving AMD the NVIDIA treatment. We're comparing AMD's fake frames to real frames, but we're not yet comparing NVIDIA's fake frames to AMD's fake frames because we'll do that fake later. That means this video will include frame by fake frame analysis of AMD's generated images versus native only rendering. Sometimes you can see ghost images, such as in Kratos' swing over the snowy background, where there's a blurring of the axe and the arms as the AFMF, or Advanced Fluid Motion Frames from AMD, interpolates in between frames. In this video, we'll also talk about FSR 4 versus prior FSR iterations in native. In some scenes, like this one, image clarity and stability are greatly improved over prior FSR versions. The Ultramarine's armor and hanging cables both show significant improvement in the newer version versus the older. In other scenes, like this one showing an air assault, we can see heavy warping with FSR 3.1, the older version, but still modulation with FSR 4 for the flying units. The ground assault shows issues with shadows pulsing underneath with Tyranids in both versions. Smeared trails behind NPCs and barrels are improved upon with FSR 4, but are still sometimes present. So we'll be looking at AMD's FidelityFX Super Resolution 4, FSR 4, on AMD's new 9070 XT and comparing it to the prior version. We haven't done this treatment for AMD in a while, just like we didn't do the DLSS comparisons for NVIDIA for a while, and they had a major change with DLSS 4 as well. So this is an image quality specific test. We're saving the performance for another time, and that means we're inspecting images very closely for this. And like we said with the NVIDIA coverage, with DLSS 4 and with MFG, or multi-frame generation, not all fake frames are created fake equal. And that's what we're looking at today. In part, we're also looking at just FSR in general. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duronaut thermal paste. Thermal Grizzly claims its Duronaut paste is intended for long-term stability and endurance, focusing on paste longevity in addition to the usual performance focus. Thermal Grizzly's Duronaut paste comes with applicators and spreaders, and ships in numerous tube sizes, aiming to provide a high-end paste for PC builds and daily driven overclocks by enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. Now, what we're not doing here yet is comparing FSR 4 and AFMF to DLSS 4 and MFG. That might happen later, especially if there's interest, but first we need to sort of lay the groundwork for how each of these companies' technologies does on its own, so we have sort of the full airtime to explore just their own tech in their own bubble, and then we can expand that and compare it against some of the competition from both Intel and NVIDIA these days. Now, one important thing to remember with all of this is, just like we said with the NVIDIA coverage, what we're doing here as part of the image quality comparison is purposefully slowing things down and often zooming on detail elements. And what that means is that in this process of image quality comparison, we're going to see things that you might not notice in actual gameplay at full speed, as a normal speed, and sort of zoomed out as it were, looking at just the full picture in a traditional gaming sense. So you keep that in mind as you look through this. Now, some things you'll absolutely notice, others you might not ever notice unless you freeze frame it. So what we'll do is include some full speed normal footage throughout this video to help you kind of determine if you can pick it up on your own or not, and if it matters to you. Now, one final note is that YouTube compression also makes things more difficult because it is going to lose some of the detail through that compression process. We'll talk about the rest of the methodological notes a little further into the video, like the resolution, things like that. Let's get into it. We'll start with the explainer and the basics for anyone who hasn't followed it. So AMD's FidelityFX Super Resolution is what we're talking about as FSR. We're also talking about its AFMF for its frame generation solution. And FSR has finally graduated. It is now entering the AI buzzword era of its upscaling solution, in that it now has, with FSR 4, a machine-learned convolutional neural network model that is co-developed with Sony. So Sony and AMD announced that they were working on a collaboration back in December of 2024, and they dubbed this project Amethyst.
We have begun a deeper collaboration with AMD. For the project name, we're taking a hint from AMD's Red and PlayStation's Blue. The code name is Amethyst. With Amethyst, we've started on another long journey and are combining our expertise with two goals in mind. The first goal is a more ideal architecture for machine learning, something capable of generalized processing of neural networks, but particularly good at the lightweight CNNs needed for game graphics, and something focused around achieving that holy grail of fully fused networks.
Now, we won't get too into the Sony side, but Sony strongly implied at the time that it was planning to use a rebranded version of FSR 4 that was called PSSR, and this would be in order to target a 1080p native rendering resolution on the PS5 Pro, but with the upscaler doing the work to get a good quality image at 4K. On the PC side, FSR 4 will only run on the new Radeon RX 9000 series video cards right now, with no official word on backporting to RX 7000. We're unsure at the time of writing this whether it's a technical limitation or a product segmentation move on AMD's part, or a technical limitation that was created to create product segmentation reasons. The official support list for FSR 4 has 36 games at the time of writing, which is late March. It's not a lot. The number will hopefully grow as more games are updated. Several of the listed games are big Sony titles as well, which indicates that the company is serious about utilizing the technology, but also shows the partnership between them. The previous generation, FSR 3.1, is technologically distinct from the one that preceded that, FSR 3.0, and the distinction primarily comes in the way of a modular DLL, as in a file, that could be used rather than being entirely baked into the game. So this sort of paves the way for future revisions of FSR to be more easily implemented by the game developers, or just in general. FSR 4 also uses a .dll file and can be swapped in officially in FSR 3.1 games via a driver-level override on AMD's Adrenalin software in a very similar way to NVIDIA's DLSS override. However, the games also have to be on AMD's official whitelist to get the toggle to appear in the driver software. Unofficial tools like Optiscaler theoretically open the door for a lot more flexibility. We haven't tested them yet though, so we can't make a recommendation or vouch for downloading it, but there's stuff like that out there. But AMD FSR now also includes in-game fake frames, or generated frames, or synthetic frames, whatever you want to call them, under its FSR umbrella, and we haven't yet seen any indication from AMD that that's changed since the release of FSR 3.1. In AMD's words, quote, advanced frame generation interpolation technology when used with AMD FidelityFX Super Resolution, or FSR 3, inserts one frame between existing ones, end quote. However, AMD also has separate driver-level frame generation known as Advanced Fluid Motion Frames, or AFMF. These can be applied without in-game support. AFMF 2.1 is a new introduction alongside FSR 4.0. To use it, you need AMD software Adrenalin Edition 25.3.1 or newer, an RX 6000 GPU or newer, and a DX11, 12, or Vulkan game. RX 6000 only supports AFMF in exclusive full-screen mode, while RX 7000 and newer support borderless windowed. And the AMD 9070 reviewer guide stated that, quote, in-game display settings should be set to borderless full-screen mode, end quote. And that's a lot of rules, as it tends to be with these technologies from both of the vendors we've now looked at, and we'll see Intel soon enough. But keep in mind that smooth motion, which is NVIDIA's direct counter to AMD's AFMF, is exclusive to the RTX 50 series. NVIDIA has stated that, quote, support for the GeForce RTX 40 series GPUs will be coming in a future update, end quote. Now we're focusing on AFMF 2.1 here, so this isn't a direct one-to-one equivalent to the piece we just ran on NVIDIA's in-game frame gen. But we'll also be looking at the frame generation performance for AMD. For this video today, the performance we care about is image quality. We'll talk about that more in a moment, not the actual literal frame rate performance. That'll be a separate test, along with potentially latency. So just like we did for NVIDIA and its technologies like DLSS 4 and MFG, this is an isolated task. The point is to build a foundational knowledge, and then we can use that as we go forward into some benchmarking as well. So the direct comparison would in theory be NVIDIA Smooth Motion versus AMD Fluid Motion Frames, but we're focusing on just the AMD part today. So it's not AMD versus NVIDIA in this one. Just like with the NVIDIA content, we like to establish the understanding first and really focus the depth and all the airtime, so to speak, on the one company's technology. Do that for each company in its own video. Then we start looking at the head-to-heads. As for FSR testing today, our FSR comparisons will focus on FSR 3.1 versus FSR 4, with a couple references to native capture as well to serve as an anchor. We captured everything at 4K like we did last time, and with FSR we're using the performance preset for these captures today, which means that the base resolution is 1080p. And we also disabled anti-aliasing, camera effects, where possible, motion blur, some discussion on that today. Broken in some games. And we did this to get the cleanest images we could so that we could try to strip away these processing effects in games and visual effects that might otherwise make it difficult to distinguish between, is the blur we're seeing from motion blur, or is it from the technology we're actually testing? So wherever possible, we disable that kind of stuff. For this, anyway. The objectives today, again, are purely image quality. So we'll be comparing frame by fake frame image quality, FSR iteration quality, and looking at behavioral patterns of the software in general. And with that, let's get into image quality comparisons. We'll start with FSR, then we'll go into AFMF. First up is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. Like everything else we tested for this piece, FSR 4 support comes by the way of driver level overrides. We used the high graphics preset, turned off camera shake, and set motion blur to off. However, we found that the motion blur option actually doesn't work, and motion blur persists regardless, but that's a game thing. We'll start the comparisons with a scene in the armory, or the armoring hall in native Grimdark. Even before walking forward, the difference between FSR 3.1 and FSR 4 is stark. Static elements, like the floor of the walkway that shift and shimmer heavily with FSR 3.1, are now stably locked in. On top of that, the entire image is much clearer and more detailed. Examples of this include the floor, where we see improved image stability and clarity, the Ultramarines' armor showing similar improvements in a side-by-side, the distant hanging cables, a common place we see improvements between FSR DLSS improvements, and the Tech Priest's hoods. Distant candle flames that can't even be made out with FSR 3.1 are visible with FSR 4, bringing them back into existence. As we walk forward and the, we'll call it a kiosk, drops down, the difference in clarity is so obvious, it's almost like looking at two different resolutions. No matter where you look, there's improvement. The fine details under the main monitor, the Tech Priest's masks, and even just the general contrast and visual sort of discernibility of all the mechanical arms and tubes are all vastly improved. We double-checked our settings and confirmed that they were running as intended for a like-for-like comparison, so it really is just that much better in this example. This is a very promising start for FSR 4. Let's compare FSR 4 to native 4K. Space Marine 2 forces either TAA or upscaling at all times, even at native, so we went with the default of TAA for the native capture. We also did this in our DLSS comparison, which showed how some scenarios, like Cyberpunk and the Club, can actually look worse than upscaling because of TAA. The flickering and shimmering on the floor we saw, back to Space Marine 2, with FSR 3.1 is also present at native with TAA. That makes FSR 4 look more impressive here than it already did, even at the performance preset, because it's taming this undesirable behavior. We talked about this in the DLSS video, but we really shouldn't be seeing things that look worse with all defaults at native than with an upscaling technology. General detail before moving, like in the floor, the walls, and the priesthoods, is a toss-up between native with TAA and FSR 4 performance mode. That's simultaneously a critique of TAA and a praise of FSR 4. The green orb, for example, in the far distance looks very slightly better with native TAA. The kiosk, as it drops down, the level of detail between native with TAA and FSR 4 performance is very close. However, we think that FSR 4 comes out very slightly ahead in that comparison, mostly obvious in the round speaker-looking elements on top of a couple of the monitors. Like we said in the DLSS piece, once again, upscaling should never look better than so-called native these days, and game developers really shouldn't be leaning on upscaling technologies in this way. The only reason it ever does look better is because of issues with things like those presented by TAA in this scenario, which is the default here. We'll briefly look at another indoor scene in the campaign's command bridge before moving on to a mission. Once again, everything is sharper, clearer, and easier to discern when using FSR 4 versus FSR 3.x. Gadriel's face, Titus's hair, and Chiron's armor, particularly the chest decoration, stand out as night and day differences. Looking at the bridge's holographic map area, FSR 3.1 suffers from distracting flickering on some of the round grates underneath the three skulls and on the right side of the main terminal, and switching to FSR 4 almost entirely eliminates this behavior, in a good way. The thin lines within the hologram that shimmer and boil with FSR 3.1 come across much cleaner with FSR 4. The other ship visible out of the left windows doesn't show much difference, however. It could be that the largest areas of improvement with FSR 4 are in dimly lit or low contrast scenes. We'll test that with the next comparison. Loading into the decapitation operations mission gives us a brighter outdoor area. While the Marine's armor is again visibly better looking with FSR 4, the effect on the rest of the scene is more subtle, like lifting a haze rather than a total transformation. You can see this in the texture of the ground clearly, and on the shoulders of the statues. Once in motion, FSR 3.1 starts to deteriorate, but FSR 4 keeps the image clean. Unfortunately, the bugged permanent motion blur makes it hard to draw a distinction between the two FSR revisions while the Marine is rolling down the stairs. Elements such as the detail in the inlaid stone floor and the buildings to the right look better during motion with FSR 4. So far, it looks like most of the FSR 3 to 4 improvements are visible in motion. Strafing to the side shows a huge improvement favoring FSR 4 over FSR 3.1. Every single element on the screen looks better with FSR 4. The textures on the sides of the stairs, the statues, the murals against the far wall, and the guardsmen. It again gives the impression of running at a higher resolution, even though we've checked all of that and that's not what's happening. It's just better. This would be a very interesting scene to compare with the most up-to-date implementations of both DLSS and FSR in a potential head-to-head future piece. But for today, we're focusing on AMD's because we already focused on NVIDIA, so let's continue with that first. Last for Space Marine 2 is an upscaling torture test by way of a slow pan of the Tyranid assault. The flying creatures passing over the front of the massive building cause the windows to warp and blur heavily when using FSR 3.1. It still happens with FSR 4, but to a lesser extent. This is close to a worst-case scenario for any upscaler, period, just by what we're looking at on the screen. In both the air and on the ground, FSR 3.1 causes the creatures to blur into a mass, sometimes phasing in and out of existence or just blending together. FSR 4 isn't totally immune here either, but again, it does a way better job than the prior version. Since this scenario is so hard on upscalers, let's compare it to native with its forced TAA again. Watching the flying creatures in front of the windows shows us what it's supposed to look like, free of the heavy warping seen with FSR 3.1, or even the warping light modulation seen with FSR 4. Looking at the ground assault again shows us just how well FSR 4 is handling this relative to FSR 3.1. It's very close to the look of the native capture, but still suffers from an effect that makes the shadows underneath the Tyranids appear to pulse and shift underneath them. At this level of fine detail and chaotic movement, even native with TAA struggles a little bit with grain and warp. Some areas are cleaner, but like we said earlier, this particular game has toss-up comparisons between them. Monster Hunter Wilds is up next. We used the high graphics preset, but turned off anti-aliasing and camera effects like motion blur, vignette, and depth of field. We also reduced camera shake to its minimal levels, and cutscenes are entirely in-engine, which is useful, so we got a mix of those with some actual in-game capture as well. Taking a quick look at the title screen animations shows little difference between FSR 3.1 and FSR 4. Textures and edges are slightly sharper with FSR 4. The stippled effect on the fur, as seen with FSR 3.1, is also almost entirely gone with FSR 4. There's not much else to discuss here, so let's move on. Jumping into the actual game at the point you choose your weapon by the small oasis shows an ugly pattern superimposed over the sand when using FSR 3.1. This goes away with FSR 4. It doesn't make the game unplayable or anything, but it's pretty distracting. When talking to Alma, we can see that FSR 4 handles the fine strands of hair a little better than FSR 3.1 does. It also adds sharpness to the weapons immediately to her left. While running towards the training barrel, we see that FSR 4 keeps the detail of the hunter's clothes and equipment sharper. It's not a huge difference, though. The long cutscene that takes you to the main camp shows much the same. FSR 4 has a slight advantage to image quality via sharpness and minor detail enhancement. Hair, fur, and feathers benefit the most by way of FSR 4, reducing the appearance of patterns or stippling superimposed over them. One clear difference is in the trails behind objects moving across a patterned background. For example, when the two felines drop the barrel, it leaves a smeared trail behind it on the wooden walkway, as does the NPC actually on the left of the screen, and the unfortunate feline as it falls backwards. FSR 3.1 handles this very poorly, we think. FSR 4, while not perfect, definitely does better here than 3.1 did. Considering what we saw in Space Marine 2, the less drastic differences between FSR revisions and Monster Hunter Wilds is surprising. The final game we'll analyze for FSR upscaling is Marvel Rivals. To keep things consistent, we used the training range to gather footage. Static scenes don't differ much between FSR 3.1 and FSR 4 in Rivals, possibly because of the game's art style and strong default sharpening filter. We'll need to look at movement to suss out the differences, and blasting forward with Rocket's dash is a good place to begin. Even before dashing, we can see a blob of pixels around Rocket's head getting distorted in the FSR 3.1 recording, which isn't nearly as pronounced with FSR 4. As soon as we blast forward, FSR 3.1 turns into an over-sharpened, grainy mess, as seen on Rocket's gun, jetpack, tail, and the ground below. FSR 4 is able to cope with the sudden movement far more gracefully, and only gets bad around the finer points of detail like the spikes on Rocket's knees and the hair or fur on his head. Next, we strafed to the side while shooting. Before moving, we can see a repeating pattern overlaid on the left side of the ground, similar to what we saw in Monster Hunter Wilds that's not present with FSR 4. Once we do start moving and shooting, FSR 4 retains more detail in the bullets' trails than with FSR 3.1. After dropping off the first ledge and reloading, FSR 3.1 responds to all motion by giving everything in the vicinity of Rocket's model a kind of a deep-fried meme look, and ghosting on the trail edge of his backpack. There's still a little bit of ghosting with FSR 4, but it's greatly reduced, and the deep-fried look is gone, for better or worse. Last, we tried a wall run. FSR 3.1 handled it overall better than we anticipated, but still left horrible ghost images as Rocket climbs up across the purple banner. FSR 4 still has them slightly, but they're not noticeable to us at full playback speed in real time when you're looking at other stuff too. For the rest of the run, there's not a huge difference between the two FSR revisions outside of a slight clarity advantage and reduced ghosting, which matters more with FSR 4. We're getting into the AFMF and frame generation comparisons now. We'll play some side-by-side and frame-by-frame comparisons while setting this section up so you can just look at what's coming up. For comparison purposes, we selected games that support in-game frame generation to compare with driver-level changes. This includes Warhammer, God of War, and Marvel Rivals. In the real world, you should almost always opt for in-game frame generation over AFMF at the driver level if in-game is available. The most obvious downside of AFMF is that it has no awareness of UI elements, so menus, text, and icons may be distorted. Although we saw NVIDIA struggle with this even with in-game frame generation. All footage for AFMF comparisons was captured at 4K 120 FPS. A 7900 XTX with Adrenalin 25.2.1 was used for AFMF 2.0 capture, and a 9070 XT with 25.3.1 was used for everything else. AFMF search mode was set to high, and performance mode was set to quality, the recommended settings for our setup. AMD is more direct than NVIDIA about recommending FrameGen only in scenarios where the game can already run at least 60 FPS. We stuck to that recommendation. This is something we've talked about in the FrameGen content previously, where the really common misconception is that FrameGen takes something unplayable and makes it playable. It doesn't really do that. It just smooths things over. As with NVIDIA FrameGen, the vendor's capture utility, so Radeon Relive in this case, was the most practical way to capture. But because we can't manipulate the rate of frame generation like we could for NVIDIA, we'll have to rely more on frame-by-frame comparisons. We also constantly had issues with AMD's Record and Stream tab disappearing after reboots. So AMD, if you're listening, please fix that. This needs to be resolved, and yes, our IGP is disabled. First up is Warhammer. We used the same settings for Space Marine 2 that we did for the FSR comparisons, with resolution upscaling set to FSR and render resolution set to native, since it can't be explicitly disabled. We set motion blur intensity to off, even though the setting doesn't work. FrameGen worked with full screen enabled, so we left that setting alone. We'll start with a worst case scenario. We recorded an additional scene in Space Marine 2 to show the downsides of frame generation. These clips aren't tightly controlled or synchronized. We just loaded into the main hub and shook the mouse around violently. So we'll play it back slowly or freeze frame some parts to show the issues. You're seeing some of them now. Besides making it very obvious that motion blur was still on, despite being toggled off, which again is a game issue, this allows us to see multiple frames where AFMF is definitely applied on top of UI elements like the assemble waypoint. Applying frame generation on top of UI elements can cause ghosting and duplication of UI elements, which just looks bad. We can compare this to the in-game frame generation option, which is also garbled and a muddy mess in this scenario. The distortions around the edges almost look like eye floaters or something. It completely breaks in this scenario, but perfectly preserves the UI layer, even in the worst frames, which isn't useful, but at least it does it. Rapid movements like this aren't out of the question for mouse and keyboard users. They're especially common in certain types of games, or if you get bored in the game, but shooters in particular, where a fast or twitchy response necessitates them, would really show these issues. Compared to native, these types of rapid movement scenarios are a worse experience with frame generation. Our armory scene is relatively slow, but we can still see the effects of frame generation on moving limbs versus native rendering. The telltale sign of generated frames here is the slight blurring of detail on the Marine's armor and frame-by-frame playback, like the back of his right leg as he passes under the light, but this is only really visible when closely examining individual frames in a specific location. The mandatory motion blur and application of FSR also help disguise the fake frames, since both of these effects lead to the same kind of temporal smearing that generated frames are subject to. The frame-by-frame playback of AFMF 2.0 versus 2.1 reveals greater differences, with a prominent secondary image surrounding the Marine's right arm in advance of its movement in the next real frame. This only affects moving elements of the scene, though. There's no noticeable sign of frame generation in the relatively static background, even with the older version. By rolling down the stairs, we can see a weak point of frame generation, although the inescapable motion blur makes it harder to detect. There are multiple frames where the first details of the Marine's armor are blurred, like the bottoms of his boots where lines are lost. Moving frame by frame with native and AFMF 2.1 capture side by side, there's a clear difference between the even and predictable motion blur and the irregular, faded outlines of fake frames. The Marine's feet change position more than any other part of his armor during the dive and roll, which is why they're especially prone to blurring and transparency issues. The generated frames are also identifiable by ghosting behind the bullets being fired in the background, with classic ghosting behavior causing an undesirable look. In our recent piece discussing NVIDIA's frame gen, we noted similar behavior with raindrops that made the rain effects look softer and more transparent in motion. Comparing AFMF 2.0 to 2.1 at similar frame rates, 2.1 appears to have less ghosting than 2.0. Which should help make the effect less noticeable during gameplay. In each generated frame of the AFMF 2.0 capture, there's a clear secondary image of the Marine in advance of the next real frame, as we noted to a lesser degree in the armory scene. Blurring and loss of detail can be issues, but ghosting is a much more visible downside of frame gen, and one that can ruin the experience. A comparison to in-game frame generation at the same timestamp demonstrates that it's predictably much better at preserving detail, since it's given more information to work with directly from the game engine. The in-game generation causes a crisp outline in advance of the Marine's movement, visible here around his gun and his arms, but the detail within his boots isn't distorted at all. This could still lead to the shimmering outlines that we saw with NVIDIA's frame gen, but the individual frames are closer to reality than with AFMF. We'll start off this next scene with another native comparison to establish which elements are due to regular motion blur and which are due to frame generation. The AFMF 2.1 capture matches native with its rendered frames, but it's interspersed with generated frames where the Marine's armor loses sharpness on the fast-moving legs. That's clearly an area we need to focus on, so we can move to a 2.0 versus 2.1 comparison with that knowledge. Walking sideways in front of a light background makes the difference between 2.0 and 2.1 more obvious, with 2.1 showing some slight irregularities around the edges of the Marine's legs, where 2.0 shows massive secondary images. Focus on the fast-moving parts of the model, like the shins and the knees. As usual, the resulting effect would be easier to notice in motion if there weren't already other blurring effects forced on us with this game. God of War ran well above 60 FPS on the 9070 XT even at Ultra, which made it harder to capture generated frames, so we kept our testing brief. The Ultra preset was used with motion blur, film grain, and camera shake disabled. We expected FSR to be forced when in-game frame gen was enabled, but the options menu didn't reflect that, so the scaling method was set to TAA and the quality to native for all tests. Scaling cannot be explicitly disabled, or we'd just do that. As expected, the moments of rapid movement during Kratos' wind-up and swing are the most difficult for AFMF to deal with, whereas the native capture clearly shows each frame of his arms and the axe as it moves. The AFMF 2.1 capture has individual frames with obvious attempts at interpolation. This is most noticeable directly on the models, since the trail of particles behind the axe is already an intentional smear. By swinging Kratos' axe in front of the white snowy background, we can clearly see ghost images with the older AFMF 2.0 frame generation. Direct frame-by-frame comparison is more difficult here due to the lower frequency of generated frames, but it's clear that the generated frames with 2.0 more commonly have ghosting around the axe and even Kratos' model. 2.1 shows some artifacts as well, but it's usually in the form of unevenness in the outline of the axe and Kratos' arm as they swing forward, while the core of his model is better preserved. Checking back against God of War's specific implementation of in-game frame generation, we see the same behavior as in Space Marine 2, where the details of Kratos and the axe are excellently preserved. But there's a distinct outline where FrameGen has done its version of content-aware fill, basically, in the area that those objects will occupy in the next real frame. In comparison, the full-screen AFMF 2.1 effect has more distortion around the usual axe and arm area. The movement of the axe in this small QuickTime event was too rapid for either 2.0 or 2.1 to keep up with the large deltas between frames leading to a similar appearance from both AFMF versions. The head of the axe appears doubled in some generated frames with additional distortion around the handle. It's difficult for any type of frame generation to compensate for large deltas between frames, which is part of why AMD recommends running at 60 FPS before even turning it on, with latency being the other part. Marvel Rivals is next. Starting with the jump pad, we can see at the beginning of this scene that both AFMF 2.0 and 2.1 show ghosting on the rings that rise up from the pad. Once in motion, both iterations have trouble keeping up with the rapid movement, but 2.1 does a moderately better job of preserving Mantis' outline. The distance between the secondary image and the core of Mantis' model with 2.0 creates a greater blurring effect, and although the generated frames with 2.1 only roughly maintain the shape of her hands and feet, the resulting silhouette is stronger. As she approaches the apex of the jump, the distortion occurs in the background instead, with 2.0 more commonly showing doubling of scenery elements like the railing immediately in front of Mantis. Marvel Rivals' in-game frame generation version behaved the same way as God of War's and Space Marine 2's, with crisp outlines around the next known position of Mantis' model, visible above the knees in these frames, coupled with some after images trailing behind the arms. The overall effect is still far cleaner than AFMF, especially since the artifacts only apply to Mantis' model, leaving the scene behind her almost completely clear of fake frame problems. We don't recommend using FrameGen for games like Marvel Rivals, where latency is a concern and rapid mouse movements are common. FrameGen is kind of like VSync, only in the sense that it's at its best as a cosmetic upgrade, maybe, and at its worst, it's a source of latency. In this scene, we can see distortion around Mantis' hands with AFMF 2.1 and advance on the motion they're about to make as she fires. But a rendered frame was buffered in order to generate that image, whereas without FrameGen, rendered frames are simply delivered when they're ready. Notice also that with AFMF, Luna Snow's name tag is distorted on the first frame where the camera shakes, which is a further disadvantage of AFMF versus in-game frame generation. Using the in-game option, the name tag is preserved. In Cyberpunk, we used the high preset without ray tracing and set FSR 3 to native AA, since FSR is required in order to enable in-game frame gen. First is the car scene. Keeping an eye on the headlight beam as it passes over shrubs and rocks to the right of the road, we can see that the scenery appears to wiggle slightly with AFMF 2.1, as the generated frames don't place objects in precisely the correct location. With AFMF 2.0 in the same areas, there's a much simpler loss of detail as every generated frame is a blurry mess. The area on the shoulder that tracked slightly wrong with 2.1 is instead completely layered with a ghost image in 2.0. So between the two, we prefer the newer version here, but native rendering without fake frames still looks the cleanest. Moving to a 2.1 versus native comparison, we can see that the wiggling behavior is definitely an artifact of AFMF and not something carried over from the original native render. The native capture has fewer frames, obviously, but the objects to the right side of the road track in a clear, straight line between frames as opposed to the slight side-to-side shifting with AFMF 2.1. Native should typically be crisper, even if less smooth, so this makes sense. Using the game's built-in benchmark scene, we can again see that 2.1 is more prone to distortion in areas where 2.0 would ghost and blur, with the vertical pillar here turning into a wavy line and fake frames. As the camera passes the corner with pages from the Night City Journal, 2.1 does a much better job of preserving text and fine detail, where 2.0 just ghosts. Moving to a later part of the scene, frame-by-frame playback reveals more distortion visible with 2.1 as the camera passes over the barbed wire fence. Straight lines remain clear with 2.1, but they don't remain straight. As usual, 2.0's equivalent is a fully duplicated ghost image of the fence in each generated frame. Again, we can check back against the native footage for confirmation that the behavior we're seeing comes from AFMF. The horizontal fence bars are straight and uninterrupted in each frame of the native capture, whereas they're frequently broken up and uneven in the AFMF 2.1 footage, although AFMF 2.1 does do a fairly good job of preserving the scene behind the fence without major frame gen distortion. First of all, this is an image comparison piece, image quality, and from that perspective, FSR 4.0 is an improvement over FSR 3.1, and AFMF 2.1 is an improvement over 2.0. Both of these are good things, because if those weren't the case, then AMD is using numbers wrong, and we would have a much bigger problem to talk about. Whether or not it's worth using these technologies at all is more situational, just like with DLSS. So, first of all, it's going to be highly specific to the games and also the person playing them. The use cases for these, for FSR, for example, it's definitely a good alternative to lowering the settings, but when we've polled our audience in the past, there have been a lot of people who would prefer to lower the settings than to use something like FSR or DLSS or XeSS for some kind of upscaling approach. So it's really going to be something that you should just toggle it and decide if you like it or not. And while that may sound like a kind of wishy-washy answer, we're not giving you a clear turn it on or off conclusion, that is the answer. It is very situational. Now, the good news is it's easy to turn these technologies on and off. You should restart the game between doing so and just see if you like it or not. And the reason for that is some people will prefer the higher graphics quality with the potential sort of image quality losses that you get with upscaling technologies, and other people won't. They will want the opposite, and that's just going to be how it is, subjective. So back to whether or not it's worth turning on, the best answer we can give you is that we think it's a good alternative, just like DLSS, to lowering settings in some games versus running at lower performance. So if you're trying to fix the performance issues and you want the higher settings, generally speaking, both DLSS and FSR in their newest versions are working well for that. Now, again, there's kind of a lot of broader resistance to the idea that we need any of these at all, and it's kind of bullshit that we end up with situations like we talked about in Cyberpunk, where the native default settings can look worse than with an upscaling solution. That shouldn't happen. That's bullshit, but that does appear to be the way that game development is going. Now, the games we tested using FSR 4.0 as an override was an improvement over past versions, so that's good. We'll break this into AFMF and FSR discussion. So, really the simplest version of all of this is that AMD has improved generationally on its version of these technologies, so FSR 4 is better than the prior version, and AFMF is better than the prior version, and that's how these things should go. The challenge, though, is whether you want to use them at all, and so with frame generation, you still get some of those really nasty looking images that just are clearly not how the game was intended to look. You get ghosting sometimes for some of these technologies. You get doubling up of images, distortion of text. And so for a lot of people, you're going to see that and just want to turn it off. And it's also going to depend on the game. Now, upscaling is a little less clear what the decision is because, again, it comes down to if you're struggling to run the game at all, it's a choice of sacrifice. Do you want to sacrifice the graphic settings, or do you want to sacrifice things like the image quality and the sort of crispness of the image around edges of things? And for some people, it just may not be a choice if the game's running poorly enough. Overall, FSR 4, just like DLSS 4 when we tested that, is an improvement over the preceding version of it. And that's what we want to see. But also like DLSS, the degree of improvement on the scale of a little bit better to totally transformative experience, it's going to be closer to that a little bit better side. This isn't going to change how you see games at a spiritual level. Although I will say, from what we've seen at peak fanboyism on Reddit for either NVIDIA or AMD, technology changing how you feel at a spiritual level seems more common than honestly it probably should be. Now, what we may do next is look at FSR 4 versus DLSS versus XeSS in a future content piece, probably after they're all updated again. It takes a little while to get through these things. And that'll let us look at the direct comparison between the competitors and how they each do these things rather than against themselves and iterationally how are they improving on things, which is what we've been focusing on. So the next step is probably to look at Intel, and then we'll eventually work towards doing a comparison of each of them against each other. It's going to be a really complicated video to make. We'll we'll probably have to break that into pieces as well and focus on just image quality for upscaling and just frame generation or something once again. So we've done these in the past, but these are all, they've changed a lot. They have improved massively since, for example, the days of DLSS 1 and 2, which really had some awful image quality issues. But anyway, that's it for this one. So hopefully that's helpful. This stuff's getting incredibly complex. It's difficult to benchmark now because there's all these different levers you have to decide whether to pull or not, and what represents the user experience, and what do people actually like to use. And so genuinely, as we've said in the DLSS ones, it is helpful to us if you leave some kind of comment below on if you even use upscaling solutions. So one thing that would help me to know is, as mentioned earlier, given the choice between lower your graphics settings or maintain them, but use an upscaler when you simply have to improve the performance to play the game, which of those two do you prefer? That is helpful to us to know kind of, we can make a choice, but it's so subjective. It really helps to see what the largest group of people think, so we can try to represent that as we continue to test this stuff. So that's it for this one, though. Thank you for watching, and as always, you can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support us directly, like by grabbing one of these shirts, which are on the store. It's the Broken Honey Pot. And otherwise, we've got a lot more cool content coming up, and we will see you all next time.